Hey, so this week the Knesset passed a law about reforming the judicial system in Israel. And the question is, are we going to civil war? I'll answer that question and a lot of other things next on my news analysis. Hi, so let's start our discussion today with what happened on Monday at the Knesset in Israel. The Knesset passed a law that it's actually an amendment of basic law, the judiciary, that places a constraint on what's called the reasonableness doctrine. And to understand what happened and its implications, it's important to understand what the reasonableness clause or doctrine actually is. The Reasonableness Clause is something that was invented by Aaron Barak as a justice in the Supreme Court in the 1980s. Basically, it's an idea of administrative law. Administrative law is supposed to oversee what the government does to see if it's acting inappropriate, if it's acting illegally, unlawfully in its execution of its duties. So, for instance, if a clerk at the post office decides that although the post office is supposed to be open from 8 o'clock in the morning until 6:30 in the evening continuously, that he doesn't think that it's necessary to open the post office that he works at until 11 o'clock in the morning, and that he's arbitrarily deciding that he's going to close it at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and not reopen in the afternoon. So that's a kind of thing that administrative law is supposed to remedy. You're supposed to be able to go to the court and sue and say, hey, this guy is not operating correctly. And then the courts are supposed to be using the administrative law to do it. So Barak introduced this idea of unreasonableness. So he would say, well, it's not that the clerk at the post office is behaving unlawfully or whatever, but actually that this is unreasonable, or more to the point, it's unreasonable for the IDF to carry out an operation in this way against terrorists in Judea and Samaria. They should be doing it in that way because that would be a more reasonable standard. So the idea of reasonableness as a basis for administrative actions by the court was invented in the 1980s. And then in the 1990s, Barak introduced this even more weirder idea, which was that there's no distinction from his perspective in the application of the reasonableness idea between the postal clerk that wants to sleep late and go home early and the prime minister of Israel. That the court gets to second guess the judgment of the government, just as it can second guess the judgment of a postal clerk. So, for instance, the court decided that the then Treasury Minister Moshe Kaplan was acting unreasonably when he decided not to place an extra tax on rolling tobacco a few years ago. Well, he decided that he didn't want to add an extra tax on rolling tobacco because he had promised no new taxes. And so he had an election pledge to voters where he said he wasn't going to raise taxes. The judges say, with all due respect, we're going to second guess your judgment. Your political pledges to voters are meaningless. We think that rolling tobacco is really hazardous to people's health, and therefore, we're going to overturn your decision and compel you to tax tobacco. Or, Barak originally used it to say, well, in the 1990s, we think it's unreasonable for the Rabin government not to fire a minister named Pinchasi who had been indicted for whatever graft, and, he hadn't been tried, he hadn't been found guilty, but, he's indicted, and therefore it's unreasonable for him to serve in the government. The fact that then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin didn't agree with them was neither here nor there. Barak decided that he knew better than Rabin, and therefore Rabin was compelled to fire Pinchasi and later Shas leader Aryeh Deri when he came under indictment, because that's just the way it goes. And really, it's moved on to every aspect of government policy, from the most serious to the most mundane. So, for instance, the Supreme Court decided that the government was wrong to give the Israel Prize to one candidate because they didn't like what he said, and therefore he was not a reasonable winner of Israel's highest civilian prize that's conferred by the government. And on another occasion, when a professor at Ben Gurion University had the decision to provide him with a prize revoked by the education minister because he had called for an academic boycott of Israel, the Supreme Court compelled the government to reinstate the prize to this professor because they thought it was unreasonable to punish him as an Israeli academic, calling for the international community or the United States and Europe, etc., to boycott himself and his institution. So they get to decide everything. And over the past 3 decades since Barack did this, and really the Supreme Court went into high gear in terms of undermining government policies and taking away the government's ability to make any judgments about anything, or opening made by every government minister, the government, the prime minister, to being second-guessed by these unelected, self-selected 15 justices of the Supreme Court. That concept of reasonableness sort of became the ground zero of criticism and calls for judicial reform in Israel. And it used to be, of course, viewed that way as sort of a consensus issue. So what did the law that the Knesset passed on Monday with a vote of 64-0 because the opposition boycotted the vote? And the answer is that all it does is say, it allows the court to continue second-guessing mayors and non-elected officials at every level of government, but it says you can't second-guess the judgment of the government and government ministers. That's all it says. So you can't. These are people that, were elected because of their judgment. They received the confidence of voters because of what they said that they believe in, and they have to be able to make decisions that they deem, and you're going to have to use another excuse to intervene in their policies. And there are, by the way, ample means to do it. Even Barack himself acknowledged that in an interview a couple of years ago, that he didn't have a problem, he said, with overturning the reasonableness standard because he's got lots of other ways to overturn government decisions, including another rule that he invented about proportionality. But whatever the case, so all the law does is constrain the court's ability to intervene, to overturn, to abrogate decisions by governments and ministers and the prime minister based on this one clause that Barack made up. And again, to be clear, this doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. Britain has a reasonableness concept, but it's basically the same as arbitrary, and it's very limited, and I don't think they use it on elected officials. So this doesn't exist anywhere else. It's one of the things that Barack made up in order to seize dictatorial powers for the court at the expense of the government and democracy and the Knesset. So the question is this important, what they did? So on one level, it's not important because, as I said, the court can figure out lots of different ways to second-guess the government, to undermine its authority, to block it from governing, and it will resort to those without question. So on that level, it's not important, but it is important because it passed. For the past 6 months, we've been subjected to constant, never-ending extortion of the government by the opposition leaders, by the media, by the rioters in the streets of Israel, that if it dares to pass anything that in any way limits even symbolically the powers of the Supreme Court, then they're going to go to the mattresses. It'll be all bets off. They're going to take apart the IDF. They're going to take apart the Israel Air Force. They're going to do lots of things. And this threat hanging over the head of the government that if they pass something, that the country is going to go to hell in a handbasket because the left is going to respond in a very dramatic way to the passage of anything that in any way limits the powers of the court. So in that respect, it's very important because even if, as the government has said, that they're willing to negotiate this bill, renegotiate it, reopen it to amendment or whatever, but that it would have to be a package where the opposition would have to agree to come to an agreement with the government on the whole landscape of judicial reform initiatives that they want to pass through. What the government was essentially saying is, don't forget, this is a parliamentary democracy. So we want to reach decisions not behind closed doors in the president's house, not on television. Let's come. You wanna debate? Fine, debate. But if you're not going to show up for the debate, we have the power to pass the laws without you, and we will. And so that was a really important thing. It said that you can't extort the overthrow of the government or the paralysis of the government. The government may not want to act on its own. It may not want to be in this situation, but it will not allow people who are extorting it to rule the day, because that really would just be the end of democracy, such as it is in Israel. And so, the question is, how is the opposition going to respond to this? And then how is the court going to respond to it? So first, regarding the opposition, well, we already saw that they lit the country on fire yet again on Monday night and on Tuesday. The doctors' union, the physicians' union, announced that they were going on strike. They were going to abandon the hospitals, abandon their patients, abandon their Hippocratic oath in order to go be hypocrites, and say that they're defending democracy by abandoning caring for the sick. And the government immediately went to the labor court, and the labor court said, okay, you can protest on behalf of democracy for 2 hours and then go back to work. And so that's what happened. So that was a dud. We saw that Moody's put out a no, you bad boys and girls letter on Monday saying, well, you passed this law and that's too bad and that's no good, but your credit rating, Israel, is still minus. We're just going to say something nasty so that the media can leave us alone. Because that's the thing, is that the left, according to the media reports, has been using everything it has, including the kitchen sink, to try to lobby Moody's and the other credit rating institutions in the world to lower Israel's credit rating. They want to tank the economy to show that this is what they can do, that this is punishment for passing this law, and they failed. Moody's stood up to them in a way. I mean, it wrote a nasty letter, but it didn't change Israel's credit rating, just as it didn't change Israel's credit rating in the first iteration of these riots in March. And then there's violence. We had Ehud Olmert, the ex-con, the former prime minister, went on Britain's Channel 4. He's finally, reinvented himself as I don't know, the Che Guevara of the revolution or whatever. So he goes on Britain's Channel 4 and he says we're moving towards civil war, which sounded a lot like inciting civil war from where I'm sitting. And then last night, Monday night, in Israel, there were some, we talked about this in previous shows, that you have these people who live in the cities, live in places like Kiryat Shmona, and the leftists from the kibbutzim around Kiryat Shmona came and blocked traffic in Kiryat Shmona a few weeks ago as part of their pro-democracy protests. And so a bunch of people from Kiryat Shmona went to all of the kibbutzim and blocked them from going back home. And so last night, the same thing, leftists from the kibbutzim around Beersheba blocked traffic in Beersheba for a few hours. And so then you had some people from Beersheba who went to these kibbutzim to block the entrance to the kibbutzim. So one of the kibbutzim that they went to was Kibbutz Hatzerim. And they showed us footage of all of the they showed this footage where you have, I don't know, maybe a half a dozen from what I saw, maybe a little bit more people standing there blocking with their cars the entrance to the kibbutz. And then the security officer from the kibbutz gets out of his car. He's a member of the Brothers in Arms, one of the most militant insurrectionist groups that have been harassing, assaulting Israeli government ministers and members of Knesset and the coalition outside of their houses and in hotels, restaurants, all the rest of it. So they've been very violent. So this guy is one of the members of this Brothers in Arms group. He gets out of his car. He had just come from Beersheba, apparently, where he was blocking traffic. And he gets out and he sees this half dozen or so government supporters blocking his entrance into his kibbutz. He pulls out his gun. He starts pointing it at them, and then he shoots it in the air. Nobody was threatening his life. Nobody had a weapon. Nobody even had not a sidearm, not a knife. And here he is opening fire. And it's not clear whether he was arrested or whether he was remanded to custody. If this obviously had happened to a right-winger, it happens all the time to the settlers in Judea and Samaria. They're actual victims of terrorist attacks, whether it's rock throwing, Molotov cocktail throwing, or whatever. They get out of their cars, they shoot in the air, and then boom, they're arrested. So this is something that we've seen a lot of, and now they're starting to use violence. They're being called on to use violence, but I think that at the end of the day, I mean, this is not the kind of thing that people like to see. Because I had in Jerusalem, you had a couple of films coming out of rioters blocking traffic on Begin Highway in Jerusalem yesterday and terrorizing children who are in the back seats of their cars with their parents stuck because of these people for 2 hours on the roads. In one case, a mother was objecting to what they were doing, and so they shattered her windshield, and she had 3 little kids in the back. Today, I saw another clip of a mother being attacked and cursed because she's Haredi, she's an ultra-Orthodox Jew, and she had 2 little girls, her daughters, in the back seat. One had a pacifier in her mouth, and these people are cursing at their mother and screaming at her in traffic. So I think that these kinds of films, these kinds of videos, these kinds of incidents are going to put a damper, put it that way, in the public support for these insurrectionists. The data is already showing. I saw a poll today came out saying that I think over 70% of Benny Gantz's voters want him to sit down with the Likud and try to reach a compromise on judicial reform going forward. And 49% of Yesh Atid voters want Yair Lapid to do that, which is interesting because they've always been considered more extreme. And still you have a near parity of nearly 50%, 49% of Yesh Atid voters want that. So that's new. So that means that support on the left, obviously there's no support on the right for what they're doing. Support on the left for what they're doing is diminishing. People woke up this morning after the bill was passed into law and they saw that Israel is still a democracy. So I think that that's having an impact. But you have this hardcore radicals that are sort of led by Ehud Barak, the former prime minister, former defense minister, former IDF chief of staff. And this video from 2020 came out, I think last week, showing him describing in granular detail precisely what we're seeing today, that it was supposed to be against Corona, but using the Air Force, using Air Force pilots, using to threaten to take apart the IDF and all the rest of it. And one of the questions that was broached to him by one of the radical leftists who used to be a pilot was, is there any consolation in which you'll come back to power? A lot of us would like to see you back in the prime minister's role. And so Barak said that he had talked to somebody about that once who told him that the people will call him back to service as prime minister of Israel when there are bodies of dead Jews killed by other Jews. Floating in the Yarkon River in Tel Aviv. So it's given what he's done now, and we've talked about this a lot on the show, that he really instigated everything that happened before there were even elections November 1st, and certainly before the government was formed in December of last year, and before Justice Minister Yariv Levin presented his plan for judicial reform in January. So this was all pre-planned. It has nothing to do with judicial reform. And Barak sees himself returning to power only if there is a civil war and Jews are killing Jews, and there are Jewish bodies that were put there by other Jews floating in the Yarkon River. So there are people like Barak, people around Barak, who want this kind of thing. We saw Olmert again. I opened with this, calling for civil war on British television. So we have that. And we have the media. The media received money from these high-tech gurus to run front page ads. This is in Yisrael Hayom, my former employer, I got fired from because I was pro-Netanyahu last year, and Yediot Achronot and Kakalist and The Marker and Haaretz all had the same front page, which was just all black, right? All black, and it was paid for. And it was, they can't reject ads. When I was working in Israel Hayom, when I was working in Maariv, when I was working, by the way, Maariv didn't do it. I wonder if they refused to. And other newspapers and Jerusalem Post, ads, political ads that were antithetical to the values of the company were rejected. But Tuesday morning, Israelis woke up to this because the journalists agreed, the editors of these papers agreed that their job was not to print the truth. It's not to describe reality to people. It's to use their positions as editors of newspapers to demonize the majority of Israelis who voted for this government on a platform of judicial reform. It's to hide the nature of the law that was passed from the public and its implications, et cetera, et cetera. So, we see this behavior by the media, that they're part of the insurrectionist camp that are driving a wedge between Israeli citizens. And so long as they continue to maintain their full mobilization on behalf of the insurrectionists, I think that, that it'll continue on. But, I think that the ratings, Channel 14 is, now within spitting distance. Nobody thought this was possible, of Channel 12, which is, has a monopoly basically on primetime coverage, including the news, and has for over 20 years. And now Channel 14 is, for the first time, that's the right-wing station, is starting to approach them at primetime hours, which is a remarkable sea change. And I think that people are seeing that they're paying financial price, and also price in terms of dwindling relevance to the public and to the discourse in Israel. So maybe they'll have a reassessment of what they're doing, but I don't know. And that leads us to the judges. What are they going to do? So, in a way, it was very clever to pass this law. It was clever to pass this law because, obviously the judges, so immediately the movement of quality government, which I think we've mentioned in the show in the past, receives money from the U.S. government. They immediately petitioned the High Court, to overturn the law, which places limits on the court's power. So the court has to, adjudicate an issue of its own powers. And I'm sure that the court will accept it. And here's the deal. It's sort of embarrassing to the court, right? Because you have Fayut, the Chief Justice. She's retiring. Esther Fayut is retiring at the end of the year. She's probably going to take this case. And then the question is, does she want to go out in a pillar of smoke, which I think she does, or does she want to be remembered as somebody who tried to bring peace to Israeli society? I think that it's pretty clear that she wants the former, not the latter. But no matter how you slice this is going to look bad for the judges, because they don't have any statutory basis to strike down a duly promulgated basic law that was passed by an absolute majority in the Knesset of 64 to 0 on an issue, again, and in a basic law that relates to the Supreme Court's own powers and its power, the power of the Reasonableness Clause, which doesn't exist in any actual law, but rather they invented and seized for themselves. So it makes them look really, really bad. And, it's not clear, on the other hand, as I said, that there would be any actual consequences to leaving this law in place, because the Supreme Court has so many different ways that they can overturn government decisions, government policies, that they've invented for themselves, or proportionality, again, being the foremost one that is completely subjective, that they can use to overturn perfectly legal government policies. So, it's not that big a deal. If they overturn it, then, they look bad. And they don't do much because the law itself doesn't do much. And it's also a way to diminish public support on the left. Again, the right is completely opposed to the court at this point. But among the supporters of the court on the left, this is a bad look for the justices. So it's not clear what they're going to do. But this leaves us with the Attorney General. Gali Baharav-Miara was appointed by Gidon Saar, and she sees her mission in office as undermining with the intent of overturning the decision of the voters from the 1st of November of last year and overthrowing the government, ousting Netanyahu from power. So she's had an interesting run of things these past 24 hours since the law was passed, really for the past 7 months since the government came into office, and she's made it her business in this world to try to overthrow it personally. So you remember how in the United States there was this whole thing in the Justice Department with the whole Russia-Trump collusion fiction that they started talking about, I think it was Rosenstein, talking to the Deputy Attorney General about the 25th Amendment and whether the cabinet could oust Donald Trump from power by claiming that he was unfit to govern, etc. So, we have, and of course, the 25th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution is about an incapacitation due to physical ailments, not to the fact that you don't like what somebody stands for, who's been duly elected president of the United States. So here, too, in Israel, we have this crazy interpretation that was kind of raised by a bunch of left-wing lunatics that you could use Israel's version of the 25th Amendment or incapacitation clause in the basic law relating to the prime minister to force him out of office. Again, the incapacitation clause is about Ariel Sharon. It was used against him when he went into a vegetative state after he suffered a massive stroke in the end of 2005. And Ehud Olmert, who was his deputy, came in and replaced him as interim prime minister before the 2006 elections. And so that was obviously proper use of the statute because Ariel Sharon was in a coma. So what the left was saying, well, there are lots of different ways to deem a prime minister incapacitated. And so, for instance, they said Benjamin Netanyahu is incapacitated because he's involving himself in legal issues when he's a criminal defendant. And let's leave aside for a second the prosecution's case against Netanyahu has completely fallen apart, as we've discussed on the show. And, the judges themselves, which are all touted as hanging judges at the outset of his trial, particularly the head of the 3-judge panel, suddenly they're telling the prosecutors, you got to drop the bribery charge. You're near the end of making your case, and you're nowhere near close to proving it, and the defense clearly isn't going to make your case for you. We suggest that you drop that charge. So the charges against Netanyahu completely fallen apart. But be that as it may, the left says, he's a criminal defendant. He can't be involved with anything having to do with legal reform because that's going to impact him personally as this criminal defendant, and therefore he should be pushed out of office because he's incapacitated. He can't use. So Gali Baharav-Miara started making noises that she thought that was irrelevant. That she intended to use her power as Attorney General to deem Netanyahu incapacitated and push him out of office. So that was why during the first iteration of the judicial reform, Netanyahu was AWOL. Why he was AWOL? Because he was afraid that Gali Baharav-Miara, his Attorney General that he inherited from his political nemesis in the previous government, was going to push him out of office. And then the government passed an amendment to the basic law of the prime minister to make clear that incapacitation means physical incapacitation. That is, like Sharon, in a vegetative state, like this 25th Amendment intended in the U.S. Constitution for the U.S. president. So they passed this amendment of the law, and that was what enabled Netanyahu to come in and be the leader that we elected him to be. So in response to the passage of the amendment of the Basic Law Judiciary in relation to that place limits on the Reasonableness Clause, Gali Barab Miara, I can't remember if she actually petitioned the court or she wrote a letter to the court supporting a petition to declare the amendment to the incapacitation bill null and void, because she insists that since Netanyahu is a criminal defendant, he is in conflict of interest, and therefore, how did they put it? I wrote it down here. She said she's asking the court to strike down the amendment to the law because it's an unworthy use of the constitutional powers of the Knesset. This is an authority, by the way, the concept of unworthy use of the constitutional powers of the Knesset that the court itself invented 2 years ago as a budget thing to try to seize the powers of the Knesset to actually legislate basic laws. And so they seized the power in a petition on the 2-year budget that ended up not being relevant because whatever. But the point is they invented this power to abrogate basic laws or amendments to basic laws based on this idea that they made up called the unworthy use of the constitutional powers of the Knesset. And so Gali Barab is using this power that these justices created for themselves 2 years ago to say that the court should allow her to remove Netanyahu from office. Then in September, did I mention to you, the Supreme Court has agreed to adjudicate a petition. What is it? Also to ban Netanyahu from office, I think, because of this, but whatever. So they're agreeing to discuss Netanyahu's ouster from office. And in the meantime, as you can see in the Caroline Glick show this week, my guest being Tony Bedran, who is an expert on Lebanon and Hezbollah and U.S. assistance to Lebanon, the threats against Israel on our borders, vis-a-vis Iran, continue to escalate. We're facing a prospect of war with Hezbollah, but everybody's attention is now completely riveted to the left's insurrection, its nervous breakdown, its temper tantrum, whatever you want to call it, against the Israeli people for not being leftists like them. And this is a really disturbing thing. So I'm glad that I interviewed Tony this week for the Caroline Glick show so that we could actually look into some of the strategic developments that are alarming that are happening now. Just one last word before I sign off in that realm about the IDF. So, you're still having these threats. The IDF doesn't seem to have suffered any loss of readiness or in the a number of reservists showing up. To the contrary, you're getting more and more reports, particularly in the ground forces, that you have over 100% call-up rates in combat units. So, this is the threat of insurrection is not happening. As for the Air Force, we'll have to see. Also, as Shai Kalach said on the show last week, the reports of the Air Force's non-refusal to be mobilized for war because of the judicial reform packages are wildly being overplayed. The biggest victim of all of this is the Air Force's reputation. I mean, they had this. I think I may have talked about it, but I just want to repeat it. Last week, they had this conference of senior commanders in the IDF from the ground forces and the Air Force, and this Air Force lieutenant colonel told his colleagues that you don't have to worry, we'll always be here when you need us, and the crowd just burst out in laughter. The Air Force is no longer trusted by the Green Army, by the land forces, so this is something that the Air Force is going to have to work on. I think it's very important, as I wrote about last week, to rethink the centrality of the Air Force as Israel's sole strategic arm in the IDF. I'm going to be writing more about that in the future, but I think that, again, the left has overplayed its hand Now, we're going to see this in the coming days, in the coming weeks. It looks pretty bad right now, but I don't think that this can maintain itself. Don't forget, Barack was pushed out of politics. He has no constituency for anything. And so the fact that he and his friends from Meretz and these other parties that aren't in the Knesset are leading this charge is an indication of their political weakness, not their political strength. And we'll just have to see. But, kudos to the government for standing up to these bullies. I know it was really, really hard. And we're just going to have to see where we go from here and keep staying strong. So take care. Those are my thoughts this week, and I'll talk to you again next week.